Greetings, everyone. Hi, my name is Keith. I am the host of Hemp. Here is my point. And today we're going to talk about how we can pay off the national debt in 10 years. That's right. How can we pay off the debt in 10 years? But before I get into that, I want to give you a brief history of how we pay taxes. There are certain numbers of ways that we collect tax revenue in the United States. Access tax, corporate tax, tariffs, and income tax. What I want to talk to you about today is income tax, how we do it through much of the income tax, and maybe the corporate tax. Now, back in 1944, this is historical. This is when the highest margin individual income tax rate was at its highest in 1944. This means this is the highest tax break of all the tax brackets that we have. Now, let me just literally explain to you who are new to this and haven't heard about how Donald Trump's budget bill he's introduced in Congress. He said he's going to give tax cuts, and people are saying he's giving tax breaks to rich people in the world. He's lowering the tax percentage for richest people in the world. Now, let me tell you about the tax brackets. That's the secret sauce, the tax brackets, right? If you look at the tax brackets, your tax is taxed proportionally, right? Which means that portions of your income, your adjusted gross income, AGI, is taxed. Let's say that you made $125,000 this year, and you were doing your taxes, and you took out your deductions, you took out your exemptions, and then you have, what that final number is, and that's called the adjusted gross income tax. That's the number that you're going to look up in your tax table book and find out how much tax you are obligated to pay the United States government. Now, how they come up with that number is that it's through a series of tax bracketing and what I call proportional income taxing, the pits, right? In the current pits, we have 7 current pits for Donald Trump that he's introduced. It's the 10%, 12%, 22%, 24%, 20. I guess it's 33%, 35%, and then 37%. Now, each of those percentages, you pay a portion of your tax. Like from the first one, the 10%, the lowest one, from $0 to $11,500. This is for single filers. $11,500, $0 to $11,500. Now, if you had $100,000 in gross income, the first $11,500 is going to be taxed at 10%. Once that's taken care of, you go to the next bracket, which is the 12%. From 12%, you have from $11,500 to $47,500. So what's the difference between $47,500 and $17,501, I guess? It's about $36,000. So your next $36,000 will be taxed at 12%. Now, just so you get a feel of it, when you tax your first portion of $11,500, you subtract that and you have $88,000 to be taxed during the course until we exhaust all of your adjusted gross income and tax and have tax all through it. Now that you have that understanding how it works, most of us will not get to the highest bracket of 37%. We won't pay that, right? This is for people who are making an enormous amount of money during the course of the year. The 37% tax bracket starts at salaries that make an excess of $609,500. So if you made, for example, you made $1 million, $390,000 of that money would be taxed at that 37%. Now we got that out the way. I have to do that. I know that some of you have already said, just tell us how we can um, solve our debt in 10 years. Now, I wanted to give you a little history. Back in 1944, the highest individual margin tax, income tax bracket was at 94%. And this was at any income that went beyond $200,000. So if you made, for example, you made $300,000, $100,000 of that adjusted gross income would be taxed at that 94% tax rate. This was back in 1944. Over the years, the highest tax bracket has been reduced, and they have adjusted the income thresholds for each bracket each year. So in 1944, believe it or not, the rich were having to pay on anything excess of $200,000, and you can look it up. 94% of that was you taxed 94% of that. Now, we're complaining, and the rich are complaining about paying possibly 39.6% when we have it on the books that there was some rich people that were paying up to 94% of the highest tax rate of their money, portions of their money. Now, here is how we can zero the national debt. We can get it down to zero in 10 years. What we would have to do is that we would have to increase the income tax brackets of each bracket a bit, and then we're going to have to increase the corporate tax. We also. Now, just to give you another history, in the same year, 1944, the corporate tax was 50%. It is currently at 25%. It is less than half of what it was a record level of 50%. So the corporate rate was 50% in 1944, and the highest income tax bracket was at 94%, if you can imagine. Now, I'm sorry, just to get back to how we can reduce the tax bracket in 10 years. We would have to have basically 6 brackets, new brackets. And the first bracket would start off at 20%. I know that's a lot. It's double to what the lowest one is now. But we've had higher ones back in the day. We would have to go 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%, and 70% will be the highest tax bracket. But that will be for monies over, when they calculate it, $1 million. And how they do it is that 20%, from 20% tax bracket would take care of incomes from 0 to 25,000. So the portion that you pay for 25,000, anything 25,000 and under would be taxed at 20%. The next bracket would be 30%, be $25,000 to $50,000. So anything from $25,000 to $50,000 would be taxed at 30%. So 25,000 of that, of your portion of money, will be taxed that if you're going beyond 50,000, if you have more adjusted income of 50,000, it would be, that portion of it will be taxed at 30%. And then 40% will be from 50,000 to 100,000. So any income in excess of 50,000 up to 100,000 would be taxed at 40%, and so on and so on, until it doubles, until we get to the 70%, and anything in excess of $1 million. So if you made $1 million, if you had adjusted gross income of $1.5 million, only 500,000 would be taxed at the 70% tax rate. So if we do this for 10 years, we could zero out the national debt, and we would have to raise the corporate tax from 25% to 35%. Now, we think that's a lot, and it is. It's not. It's not that we have never done this before. We have. And you have to think about 1944, the CEOs back then were not making as much as the CEOs are making now. They're making exorbitant amounts of money now. So again, if we can do this, but we would have to increase the tax percent. We have to increase the percentages of the tax brackets, and that's the secret sauce of when they talk about the tax cuts, is that when they're reciting these numbers we're going to be, it's going to cost, we're giving out tax cuts in $3.7 trillion, but that's over 10 years. It's not per year. And I wish they would sometimes clarify that, but they don't always clarify it. And they said this would add, if we're doing this and we're doing spending cuts and we're having 1.6 trillion spending cuts. Trust me, they're not doing it in 1 year. That's over 10 years. They're saying that they're going to be doing spending cuts, and those spending cuts are going to be over 10 years, and the total is going to be 1.6. So approximately, they're trying to cut $160 billion each year, approximately, down the budget. So they're trying to find every year. They're trying to find $160 billion, but they're going to be. They're saying because we're not bringing in that tax revenue, that lost revenue of 3.7 trillion, because we're not allowing the tax brackets to go back to its original rates, back to the 2016 prior rates. Then the tax are going to be cut. That's not going to be part of revenue, is 3.7 trillion. So we have to make up for that set 3.7 trillion of money that we don't get. So over 10 years. So what do we have to do? They borrow that money. They borrow that money by selling treasury bonds, right? So we got to stop doing that. So my idea is the only way that we can eliminate our national debt of negative $36 trillion if we raise or we pretty much double our tax brackets rates for each bracket, the 6 brackets, and we increase the proportional income tax pits, right? The pits, proportional income taxing brackets. We have to increase those income thresholds up to a certain amount to get those taxes, so we can get a bigger chunk of taxes out of it. We need more tax revenue. That's how we eliminate the deficit, and we have to do it. It would be tough for us to do that. We would have to pretty much curb our consumer spending. The world would see that we won't be spending as much or getting as much or acquiring as much, but we would eliminate our debt in 10 years and will save the next generation that's coming up behind us not having to deal with it. Now, if we are so inclined to continue with the cuts, with the tax rates that got us to zero, we can add to our government purse, or for lack of a better word, a wallet. We can get a surplus. Now, a surplus, imagine if we had a surplus of $36 trillion. That's a different government. That's a different country. We have a pool. We don't have to borrow from nobody anymore. We wouldn't owe China, Japan. And what I was told is that most of the people who give us, buy our treasury bonds, are the Americans, the most affluent American citizens. So instead of paying the taxes, they rather that the government owe them money instead of just paying the taxes. I prefer that they pay the taxes so that we don't have to incur a deficit, because the deficit reduces the value or the spending power of our dollar. So that is how we eliminate our deficit in 10 years. We would have to institute new tax brackets of 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%, and 70% will be for the highest income earners in the country, starting at $1 million. Any money that is made beyond $1 million would be taxed at that 70% tax rate. Again, I know that seems exorbitant, but if you look at the history, we have had higher tax brackets rates that took more than 70% of a certain portion of your income. So, again, my name is Keith. I'm with Hemp. This is brought to you by the book Pooxm, Pooxm. It's a new advertiser. They have introduced a correction in how we multiply negative numbers, the correct way to multiply numbers against a negative multiplier, which means that it is the second number in the multiplication expression. is the multiplier. So when, for example, -3 times a -4 is equals a +6, not 12. That is subtitled the book. You can pick up that book at pooxm.com. It is an incredible book. It is it allowed me to open up my mind to some critical thinking that applies to the rest of my life and map. I look at my credit card statement different. I look at my bank statement differently. I do not believe that I have to have a certain amount of money to be happy and to get out of debt. This book is opening up. It is a brain exerciser, as I would have described it. It is tremendous. Once I read it and once I got a comprehension of what it was trying to explain, my mind opened up to other things and it made things look much clearer, and I have got more clarity, and I look for clarity in almost everything that I do now because I read that book. It's pooxm.com. You got to check it out. Again, thanks for checking me out, and we'll see you on next time. Again, this is how we can get rid of the national deficit in 10 years. Thank you so much for checking me out. We'll see you on next time, and God bless you.